Good morning and welcome everyone to this IPL webinar. My name is David Wolfe. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab. We are joined this morning by three very engaged and well-informed panelists to discuss the topic of the politics of decarbonization. Brendan Haley is Policy Research Director at Efficiency Canada, a research and advocacy organization based at Carleton University. He also has a PhD in public policy from Carleton. And his work has examined Canadian energy transitions from a political economy and technological innovation perspective. Sarah Hastings-Simon is a macro energy systems researcher and assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, where she directs the Masters of Science in Sustainable Energy Developments. Nathan Lemfers is an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a former postdoctoral fellow at the Smart Prosperity Institute at the University of Ottawa, where he researched the regional political economy of the transition to electric mobility. I have posed three burning issues that are at the top of my mind for each of the each of the panelists, but they are going to interpret them in their own way, but I'll just briefly lay those out. We have a tremendous amount of information available about policy alternatives, but the challenge of how to make those alternatives politically feasible seems to me to be much more daunting. We seem to have no shortage of good ideas about what to do to facilitate the transition to a post-carbon economy, but much less efficacy in implementing those solutions politically. The second issue is the question of urgency. The recent IPCC report that came out a couple of months ago or a month and a half ago really raises the stakes on the urgency of moving to the post-carbon transition. And I'm wondering, I've asked the panelists whether they think, policymakers and politicians are seized with that same sense of urgency. And the final issue is the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sent energy prices, carbon-based energy prices skyrocketing, and seems to have changed the basis of the discussion at the moment to how do we obtain more oil and gas reserves, not how do we move away from oil and gas resources. And I'm wondering if that has caused a serious setback to the efforts that were underway to move to the post-carbon economy. So that's, my agenda, but I'm sure the panelists will each bring their own sets of ideas and concerns. And I will start off with Brendan and turn the mic over to you.
Thanks, David. The thing I'd like to highlight at the beginning of our conversation is that we're really at, I think, a new stage of the energy transition. And that's due to the urgency you spoke about, David, in terms of the limited time we have to confront the climate emergency. But the happy side is that there are several zero carbon solutions that are reaching more mature stages. So what we need to do now is figure out how to rapidly scale up zero carbon solutions. And I think the policies needed in this scale-up stage are different from those in the past number of decades when policymakers could use more of a linear model of innovation, focused primarily on, say, R&D on one side or creating niche markets. But in contrast, scale-up requires us to think about large-scale production of zero carbon solutions, the delivery of those solutions to the majority of the population, and not simply the early adopters. And I think that requires a policy approach that's much more focused on what I call market transformation, or the strategic transformation of both the supply and the demand sides of value chains. So let me use building retrofits as an example. That's an area I'm working on quite a bit now. The basic technologies for retrofitting a building is not all that new, but the current way we retrofit each building as a unique project, it cannot scale very easily. So there's lots of technologies whose application could help us improve productivity, such as robotics, digital monitoring and design, use of prefabricated manufacturing. There's different ways to organize the production and delivery, such as upfront integrated design involving all the different partners of a retrofit project. The question is more, how do we apply these technologies and develop new business models? So in the Netherlands, they experimented with this model called energy sprong or energy leap. And that model starts with aggregating together hundreds of buildings of the same type and creating a large scale single project. And so with that large scale and coordinated demand, you can then enter into discussions with manufacturers, contractors, and you can say, we need you to meet certain performance criteria and change the way you do things. So to deliver on these large scale projects, manufacturers started creating wall assemblies in the factory. So instead of ripping out the drywall and insulating from the inside, the retrofits could involve a crane simply putting up a panel from the outside. So you could accomplish a retrofit in that way in days instead of weeks, and people can stay inside the building when that work is done. They also wanted these all-in-one HVAC systems that could be easily installed in individual units, and those were not available on the market anyway. So what they did is they coordinated the creation of a new company that would, build those systems. So I think this is, what we need to do in terms of building retrofits presents an interesting example of how scaling up demand in a coordinated fashion can then leverage innovations in the supply chain, right, leading to lower costs, faster retrofits that can achieve a net zero standard. I guess my concern is that I don't think there are very many examples right now in climate policy in Canada that are really focused on market transformation or this coordinated reshaping of both supply and the demand. And Canada has never really embraced kind of a systems of innovation way of thinking about climate policy that would involve things like diagnostic monitoring or very close analysis to understand specific sectoral dynamics. We've tended to think about policy in these more market-based categories with carbon pricing regulation on one side, and then a very simplistic idea of any other form of policy being sort of a subsidy. So to get more into the public administration issues, if we look at a lot of project funding programs, the dominant way we select projects is through time-limited requests for proposals with relatively stringent criteria. And that is definitely the easiest way for government to do it, especially if you want to, I think, manage political risks of, say, being accused of unfairness. But the projects you'll tend to get will be ones that come from actors who are good at applying for RFPs, not necessarily those from networks that could propose transformative solutions. You'll get, I think, more off-the-shelf projects instead of projects that could require some more significant upfront work on design and outreach. So in the building sector, again, there is a R&D fund or RD&D fund. It's mostly supported smaller demonstration projects, but we don't really need more demonstration projects on how to retrofit to net zero. We need to develop systems that really can do the retrofits at much larger scale. So that energy sprong example I provided, it doesn't easily fit into any policy right now because a lot of the existing funds would have cutoffs in terms of budgets, in terms of payback periods. They wouldn't have that type of upfront support you'd need for design and sector coordination. The other interesting example is this Net Zero Accelerator for industry. This is a $8 billion fund. Because of all that money, they have a more ongoing non-competitive selection process. So that allows less rushed, say, planning. But I think the question we should really be asking here is if the government has the internal capabilities to not just approve, project proposals, but to more actively define the pathways it wants industries to follow. So as an example here, this fund has recently supported green steel initiatives. So in particular, electric arc furnaces in Algoma and Hamilton. And that is great. But it also provides an example about the need for a more coordinated approach that defines a sectoral pathway instead of just a few projects. So upstream of electric arc furnaces, we need to find low carbon ways to reduce iron ore, right? Perhaps using solutions like hydrogen. Then downstream, we need to secure markets through things like public procurement, incorporating emissions into things like building codes. So this is an area where I think actually the federal government really has the ambition to do all of this. But I think what might be missing on the implementation side is a government more willing to basically take the risk of not just selecting projects through passive RFPs, but more actively developing internal expertise that co-creates projects with the private sector and has some flexibility to identify and remove bottlenecks, throughout policy systems. So this more active project management approach that I'm suggesting, you see it in more innovation-oriented organizations like ARPA-E, like Vinnova in Sweden. And I think in Canada, we've always struggled to develop institutions like that. You can point to the politics of ministerial accountability or regional sensitivities, but it might be possible now to have this more flexible, experimental, systemic public policy approach if we recognize decarbonization as this urgent societal mission, and perhaps pull from regional strengths, which I think Nathan's going to talk about. On the politics of it, I think the other crucial issue about the scale up is the need to promote equality. The large scale deployment of low carbon technologies can increase inequalities, but it can also define a new social bargain that I think fits with low carbon solutions. So we need to find ways where the deployment of low carbon technologies accelerates social security, right? And the best example I can give here is energy efficiency for low income Canadians. Right now, the federal government has a program if you can pay costs up front, but no low income energy efficiency strategy. And that I think is a huge political liability. You see opponents weaponizing the concept of energy poverty and concerns over rising energy costs. So when we think about scaling up these low carbon solutions, we should be directing them to the most vulnerable, at every opportunity. So yes, there's a huge need for urgency. I didn't touch on Ukraine, but I do think there's actually a lot of optimism I see in people who follow energy transitions, because we're reaching this stage where we're thinking about scaling them in a big way. And we just have to think about the policy and the politics of managing that scale up.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for getting us going. That was great. I turn the floor over to Sarah. I'll just say one thing. If people have questions, please enter them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will, when we're finished the presentations, I will direct the questions to the appropriate panelist. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, David, and thanks, Brendan, for starting us off. I think I almost was like nodding along and agreeing with all the points that you were raising around this new stage of urgency and the fact that we can meet it, I think, from a technical perspective with more mature technologies that are, cost competitive and that can really help to deliver things like reduction in the energy cost burden for those that can least afford it. So I think that, to me, we're at a point where we have, excuse me, because of previous investments, we have the fundamentals that are there, but I do think that we still have quite a challenge in actually getting to the deployment. And to me, that comes back, one of the areas that I've been thinking a lot about is this concept of policy or politics different from policy that David raised. And in particular, the gap between the action and the sense of urgency, and to what extent that is sort of reflective of a little bit of a gap between the very high level, I think, sense of agreement where there is a consensus, I believe, within Canada that, climate change is a problem and it is something that we need to act on, but actually translating that down into what those, missions that the government can design and support. And in particular, really the challenge that I see in the historical examples of, mission policy or industrial policy never actually disrupting an incumbent industry. And so what I mean by that is, when we think about the classical examples of mission innovation or industrial policy, often we talk about this, the Manhattan Project or the moonshot, and we hear those evoked when we think about climate policy as well too, right? So a climate moonshot, something like that. But the first part of creating those missions is actually to have that agreement on what the mission is. I would argue that just climate itself is probably a little bit too broad. We need to go down into these different categories. Brendan was mentioning the building energy efficiency, for example. But really across the board, the issue is that addressing climate does mean a reduction in the consumption of fossil fuels. And so, as I mentioned, when we look through these historical mission examples, so there's obviously the Manhattan Project, the moonshot. Neither of those, that was sort of a special case, I would argue, of a mission. You had this central government that was buying these products. There was no real competitor that was offering something different. You're really creating new industries that incumbents in the Defense Department and in other areas of aerospace could go into. And so obviously those missions were embraced. Something actually similar happens when you look at the missions that we have historically around pharmaceutical development, and in particular, the development of new, these critical class drugs, where the development of these new drug therapies actually doesn't tend to cannibalize existing drugs, but actually just grows the overall market share for pharmaceuticals. So again, there, you're looking at a pharmaceutical industry who sees these government programs and this sort of goal of developing new drugs, again, as an opportunity. We do have sort of in the middle a little bit of a messier space where there are examples of innovation that may have, not completely grown a new market share, but at least created new opportunities, or some of the benefits were able to be captured by the incumbents, or you were addressing some kind of market share decline, so sort of staunching a decrease. And so there, I would point to examples like Semitech in the US, where you had the semiconductor industry really coming together around development of new technologies to disrupt an incumbent. However, that incumbent was the Japanese semiconductor industry. And so obviously there, that difference in the regional focus played a big role. Agriculture is another one where certainly new technologies, new crops that were more productive did decrease the market for those previous crops. But again, you had essentially the same players that were really able to capture at least some portion of the benefit that came from those more productive crops and techniques. And then closer to home here in Alberta, the example of Aostra and the development of the in situ oil sands sector, another, I think, clear example of mission innovation within the province that really, if you go back into the history of it, was resisted for quite a while the conventional industry was still growing, and it really coincided, at least. I mean, there were other factors as well too, but there's certainly a clear coincidence between the decline in conventional reserves, because production was outpacing the finding of new reserves, that opposition to development of the oil sands was dropped. And there is a lot of evidence of, this sort of historical animosity and really sense of the oil sands resource as a potential threat to that incumbency. Obviously, fast forward to today, we have a very different picture. But I think when you look historically, it's very hard to find examples where these policies actually directly challenged the incumbent, and I think that is in large part due actually to the politics of it, right? And sort of to this idea, this well understood idea of carbon lock-in, not at the point of sort of deployment of technologies or creation of the infrastructure that's needed, but actually even earlier on in agreeing what is that mission that we are all going to be chasing. And so I think that's really, to me, one of the big challenges now, with the large oil and gas sector that we have in Canada, how do you get over that that potential barrier, and how can you use some of those lessons around different jurisdictional focus? So what is the role of the federal government there? What are the abilities to leverage cases where there is clearly a current trajectory of decline already that can be used as sort of a the policy itself no longer becomes the main threat, but may actually, through adjacent competencies, become an opportunity for incumbents to sort of make things better than they would have been otherwise. And so I think exploring those becomes very important. Maybe just one other thought before I wrap up on this, the idea of what's happening in Ukraine and kind of this focus on the short term. I think that one of the things that's unique, of course, about the energy crisis that we face now is that we do have these two pathways, right? So one is producing more oil and sort of doubling down on the existing infrastructure. The other is to accelerate the transition. And I think this is a interesting illustration maybe of one of the first times that we're seeing the way that this transition period will also differ from a period of more stability within an energy system, where again, there may be disagreement on exactly how to do it or what techniques are best, but there is sort of a clear answer of, either we reduce production or we reduce consumption through efficiencies, versus now where you say there are sort of these two very different worlds that we could be driving to in response to that disruption. And I think you see that, if you look at the op-eds and things, everybody of course is sort of pushing their favorite solution to this. But I think that only actually increases the messiness of the politics through this period as well too. So I think that it's we have probably even less of a clear path or sort of orderly transition in the face of disruptions like this, even though they may end up accelerating that transition itself.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Okay, over to Nathan.
Great, thank you, David. Appreciate it. Right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about David's 3 points, especially agreeing that the urgency is increasing, but I guess I'm with Brendan and maybe Sarah that there's also the possibility for change in this sense of urgency. So we're seeing some crises unfold that are no longer sidelining climate policy, but focusing it. And you need to compare, go back to 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis and how that sidelined the momentum coming into 2006 around climate policy, and comparing that to the COVID crisis and the launch of the European Green New Deal, the development of the Build Back Better Act in the United States, and potentially we'll see what happens with this upcoming federal budget as well. And there, you saw through that a focus on decarbonization as an economic recovery strategy. And moving to the Ukraine and the energy crisis that's underway there, you've also seen a very different conversation that's happening. Even in the course of just a few weeks, you've seen it shift from, no, it is impossible to shift off of Russian hydrocarbons to, it's going to be extremely difficult and very painful to, if you're going to do it, here are the things I would do, and some of them actually aren't that impossible. They may be in fact possible. And that's pretty hopeful, I think, because that sort of conversation hasn't happened in other sort of energy crises or geopolitical incidents like Ukraine in the past. And you could look to the conversations that are happening out of Zero Week right now in Houston that's underway, which is one of the largest gathering of oil and gas executives. And you saw the OPEC Secretary General, when asked about, if OPEC's concerned about losing market share over calls for North American oil producers to ramp up their production, The Secretary General said, well, that's actually the wrong focus. It's not about market share. It's how do we mitigate? How do we overcome this crisis? So the script is no longer a simplistic take of displacing one crude oil barrel over another, but it's about making the best choices in a crisis. So you see that with Germany's response to the Ukraine war, that they're thinking of using renewable energy and energy efficiencies as a way to not only manage the spike in energy prices or supply cuts, but also as an economic sanction against a belligerent state. And even this past week as well, the US has been considering using the Defense Production Act to start shipping low-cost heat pumps to the European Union as a way for them to accelerate their transition off of Russian oil and gas. These are conversations that weren't possible a few years ago, certainly not before COVID, and how COVID used the US Defense Production Act as well and in Canada to mandate domestic production. So that is changing the conversation of how we can accelerate change. Here in Canada, we're also seeing that acceleration underway. And, you know, I would add that to the backdrop, much, you know, at a larger perspective outside of energy, that we're seeing these what were seen to be immutable institutions now being challenged across Canada. You know, I live in the Byward Market area in Ottawa, and we saw that through the trucker convoy as well. These institutions that were taken for granted, not necessarily being there in the same way. So to bring a bit more focus to my comments, I'd like to share some insights from my recent research on electric vehicles here in Canada and the varied plight between different provinces. And through this, I'll underscore the role of coalitions. So if you're have been watching the headlines, Quebec in just this last week has seen two major electric vehicle related announcements, both in Bécancour, a little town on the south coast of the south shore of the St. Lawrence River between Quebec City and Montreal. The German chemical firm BASF is developing a cathode active material plant and battery recycling facility. And GM and South Korea's POSCO are creating a $400 million facility to build this battery materials for GM's North American EV assembly plants in Ohio, Michigan, Tennessee, and also Ontario. So these investments don't come out of thin air. There's clearly been much work that's been done by the Quebec and federal governments to make this happen. But the story goes much further back in Quebec to the policy experimentation that was underway in the 1980s, where Hydro-Quebec, their electric utility, promoted R&D into electric motors, into solid state lithium batteries, and really helped to drive a broad coalition of interests over the decades beyond the usual suspects of technology or sustainability enthusiasts and environmental groups, but to extend that to medium and heavy duty vehicle manufacturers, to the mining industry, to government innovation industries. So in that way, a coalition was slowly built well before the current era of Super Bowl ads for electric vehicles. And now, once the capital is ready to move, the political infrastructure is in place in Quebec compared to other provinces in Canada. So if you look at Ontario and Alberta, they're much further behind their readiness for vehicle electrification, and a number of climate and energy issues. You know, those two provinces are often seen as having antithetical interests. So if you look at Ontario's auto manufacturing sector and Alberta's oil and gas industry, you see it play out when the price of oil goes up, the dollar appreciates because of all the oil exports, and that makes the auto sector in Ontario less competitive. So you saw this dueling invective in the early 2010s between Premier Alison Redford and Dalton McGuinty around the Dutch disease and the resource curse. But another take is that these provinces have been equally locked into something like the carbon trap. It's a term used by Brendan in terms of their mutual dependence on their primary economic sectors, which are based around carbon-based energy. And you've seen it more recently as well in these two provinces under conservative governments around efforts to delay decarbonization in both of those provinces in different ways. So both provinces have been apathetic in a certain sense towards electric vehicles. You know, and this has changed somewhat in Ontario with their recent EV assembly decisions, but things, if you look at both the supply and demand side, as Brandon was mentioning, the electric vehicle market in Ontario is much smaller. It's around 3% of total vehicle sales, as opposed to Quebec, which is around 10%. And there's, unlike Quebec, there's no battery manufacturing plants that have been announced. Quebec also has another announced $300 million Strombolt battery cell assembly facility as well. So what that means is that as the auto sector retools, Ontario is once again at risk of losing tens of thousands of jobs. And, you know, if I could provide advice to decision makers in Ontario and Alberta, it would to start looking to build coalitions with other incumbent industries. That includes the oil and gas sector, but not necessarily limited to that. In Ontario, it could be the mining sector, the tech industry, the financial sector, and some of that work is underway. And also coalitions that link urban and rural interests. And this gets at the need for decarbonization that benefits all populations, not just folks in urban areas. In Alberta, it's a tougher place. So, you know, I've lived in the province for 25 years, but not for the last decade. And I think Sarah would have much more cogent insights than myself. But there's what I see, a few missing links in that province. One of them is the link of deep decarbonization initiatives with existing industries. Those are all still remain very nascent, even though discussion of these step change technologies like CCS have been around since the mid 2000s in the province. Another is the link between decarbonization and rural economic success and self-determination. So how can addressing the climate crisis unite people and places? And I think perhaps in the Q&A, I could talk a little bit more about Ontario's experience with the Green Energy Act and that not necessarily being the case to follow in Alberta. So to wrap up, the institutions, or as a political scientist sees them, the rules of the game across Canada are in a state of flux and becoming underdetermined. You can't take the things for granted that you once did. And I think when you read the IPCC report or see the headlines in Ukraine, that can create despair, but it also creates new opportunities to forge new coalitions and to change the politics of decarbonization as we know it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nathan. So I want to give each of the panelists a brief couple of minutes to respond to or comment on what the others said. Then I have a cross-cutting question I'm going to throw into the mix for you, and then I'll turn to the audience questions and follow up with those. Brendan, did you want to come back to anything that Sarah or Nathan said?
I guess the thing that struck me with Sarah's comments is that, I mean, I think there's often disruption, there's creative destruction, but I think Sarah was talking about how the politics of it is often quite different, and it's almost who is held responsible for it. So, you know, when the pulp and paper plants close down because they're not printing newsprint anymore, you know, because of, say, the digital revolution, that's sort of these ephemeral market forces, right, that are responsible for that, not necessarily directly government. Now, of course, you can analytically trace that back to maybe public policy, but it's not as, you know, in your face. And that, so I think that is a challenge. And I think, you know, it's way easier to control. And I think the more positive is to find those beneficial pathways, you know, to do something different, essentially. And, you know, Nathan talked about how they can be quite regionally specific, right, and context specific. But the other point, I think, is that almost finding like a social bargain that fits the technology we want. I mean, so the whole literature on economic paradigms, they also talk about how, you know, the institutions need to match the technology. And I think the institutions for social security are really important. And when, you know, when the whole idea of this Green New Deal came up, a lot of people in the environmental movement, I think, were saying, well, why would we add like that policy demand on top of, you know, that sort of burden of social change on top of, you know, the technological change we want? But I actually see it like you're not going to get the technological change unless you can define a way to provide social security to people in, you know, a low carbon economy, right? And what does that look like, right? And to me, like an energy efficiency, I think it's, for instance, like, can we guarantee lower bills? Can we make sure no one's going to ever be in energy poverty? Can we use low carbon solutions to provide that type of social security instead of just, say, focusing on electricity rates, for example, which are very, you know, political? So anyway, that's what struck me about what Sarah was talking about.
Okay, great. Sarah?
So I found myself in listening to Nathan sort of absorbing his example of Alberta and Ontario versus Quebec and the preparation for electrification of vehicles through that lens exactly of, you know, who wins from that, right? And so they're, you know, seeing Quebec obviously as a major electricity producer and electricity exporter, being a province that, you know, naturally can grow its, you know, potential market for electricity through electrification of transportation, right? Whereas you have Alberta, obviously, as a, and I'm, you know, generalizing, but as a producer of oil and gas, for whom electrification is a threat. And then actually similarly, Ontario as a producer of, you know, legacy sort of incumbent automobiles, which until very recently, you know, were not electric. And I think also one can say that those manufacturers viewed electrification as a threat to their, you know, sort of their core competencies and core market. Similarly, so you know that it's sort of not an accident that you had these three provinces responding in different ways, and one sort of going after more proactively this electrification opportunity. I think also the concept of the coalitions, and I think Brendan came back to it a little bit in the social bargain as well. I think that to me is one of the key ways to sort of get over or create that demand for this kind of change. And I think that, you know, look at the coal industry in the US that I think did that very well on their part in terms of sort of creating this social bargain and creating support for the industry and the workers that was, you know, even larger than the size of the industry or the size of the workforce itself through kind of the creation of this coalition and sort of importance of the coal worker to the identity of a large part of Americans. And so I think the question is, what does that look like in moving beyond, and how do you create that same kind of social bargain or shift that coalition of support towards towards technologies that enable decarbonization? And I do think, I agree really strongly with Brendan that it's not that layering on some of these other elements of the Green Deal is sort of making it harder, but it's actually the way that you move beyond this just as a sort of more niche or sort of more environmentally focused topic to saying, no, actually, how do we sort of improve many of the different dimensions that we're looking to improve by decarbonizing?
Okay, thanks. And Nathan, response to your fellow panelists.
Sure, yeah. I think in terms of striking the social bargain, I mentioned the Green Energy Act, and it's interesting driving around rural Eastern Ontario. You see the legacy of that, where you have in rural areas that are staunchly conservative, these sunlight tracking solar arrays in different farmers' fields, and those had decent uptake, and thanks in part to generous, micro feed-in tariffs for these facilities that had a very different politics than the wind energy proposals, which divided a lot of rural Ontario and became incredibly divisive. And it makes me wonder, what are the policy frameworks or financial mechanisms that could be put in place to help encourage the interest in being part of a clean energy economy, that at least for some of the solar projects under the Green Energy Act were a success, but the wind energy projects, which have all sorts of other impacts, were incredibly divisive. There's a lot higher upfront capital costs for wind energy, and they have pollution of visual pollution, or blight, as some people like to call it. And the benefits of those projects weren't able to be shared as equally around neighbors as with solar energy projects. It removed a lot of the local decision-making abilities for communities as well to economically benefit from these technologies. So I wonder if there's new ways with new technologies, as the costs are coming down, that we could both empower these communities to locate renewable energy projects and economically benefit from them as well. And I think there's all sorts of untapped potential for that to happen under the auspices of energy independence, all these sort of cross-cutting values that sort of jam up the traditional partisan lines that you see in climate and energy policy in Canada. So I think that's pretty exciting. And I guess I have a question for Brendan as well, and I don't know if he has time to answer it, but Sarah talked about the ability or the challenge of disrupting incumbent industries, especially Alberta's oil and gas industry. And I wonder if there's an equivalent tension within the building industry as well, and where there's incumbent, for instance, home builders that are resistant to change, and perhaps there's insights that have been that you have that have shown times where these major home builders, which in municipal and provincial politics have quite a bit of political power, have been starting to engage differently on this issue of decarbonization.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Brendan, I'm going to ask you to hold off on answering that one and work it in. I've got 4 questions in the Q&A. Some of them are generally directed to the panelists, and others are directed to individual panelists. So I'm going to go through each question, and I think, if one person feels they want to answer each question, that would be great. If more than one, feel free to jump in. The first question says the environmental movement is built around saying no to things, including climate safe forms of energy. How do we build popular demand or a movement, I think in Nathan's term, coalitions, to say yes to non-fossil fuel energy at the needed scale? And Brendan, of course, was talking as well about the importance of scaling up. Who wants to take that on? Okay, Brendan and Vincent.
I can try. I guess one thing I'd like to add is, like, if you want to change politics, it's actually on the ground political organizing. So, the way you run election campaigns, finding people who support you, have them take action, build a big list of supporters, activate when needed. That's the type of on the ground work I think we need for decarbonization. It's not just smart policies or narratives. And I say that because, we talk about these decentralized technologies, mostly decentralized low carbon technologies, and how great they are. Well, one of the challenges is it's really hard to organize a whole bunch of decentralized companies, a whole bunch of decentralized units. And so I think the model is not so much sort of peak associations you might see with, say, the 6 major oil producers, but almost like a organizing model, more like a union or a political campaign. And so I think we need to think about the policies we can have that can develop good political coalitions, and I think those tend to be more tech specific instead of general, like carbon pricing. But the other aspect of it is, how do you actually organize a very decentralized sector? And if you can organize it, I think it's got huge power because you've got these great connections to communities throughout the country, but it's not going to be organized in the same way that perhaps you would the cement industry or the oil industry.
Okay, Sarah, did you want to?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add really briefly. I mean, I think on top of that, I guess, or in addition, I would look at what are ways that you can show people benefits and what they get out of these other forms. So not so much a negative focus on, we need to move away from carbon, which of course is true, but what comes in addition, right? So we've seen that in an example of the coal phase out, for example, in Alberta, which maintains a relatively high level of popular support. And I think attribute part of that to the health benefits of the coal phase out. And, we saw a reduction in kids ending up in the hospital in the middle of the night, with an asthma attack and things like that. So where are there ways that, people see those direct benefits? I mean, you talk about coalition of supports, for better or for worse. I think there's a big group of people that own Teslas that are super excited about them, not because they are, reducing carbon emissions primarily, but because they're fun to drive, right? And so I think that is a big piece of where there needs to be a focus as well too on, how are there the ability to use small electric motors on bikes to open up, biking to more people. What are things that these technologies that are going to enable decarbonization also bring us and add to our, lives and our experience that makes people excited?
Okay, so I have a question about energy security and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Someone's asking, what do we see about a 5-year horizon regarding energy security given the invasion of Ukraine? Do we believe that Europe will continue to lead innovation in promising post-carbon energy technologies and towards electrification? And does this, there's two, and this leads into another question as well. Does what's going on in Europe at the moment move the Europeans towards reconsidering, not only the Europeans, but the rest of us as well, towards reconsidering the role of nuclear energy in the post-carbon transition? No one has really talked about the nuclear energy sector. And there's two questions that really raised that. Who wants to take that one on?
Brendan. I'm happy to start. I think I think I'm fairly optimistic. I mean, I think we're learning that you can't get off of fossil fuels overnight, but also if you want stuff that works fast, I don't think you would look to nuclear. I think you'd look to heat pumps and insulation, and a lot of the discussion now is trying to make the permitting processes for wind turbines and things like that a lot quicker. So I think that's where I actually see the discussion going. I mean, I think there is a role for nuclear in a low carbon economy, but I also think one thing we're learning is that nuclear is highly vulnerable to attack. And, if, from, my understanding is your economy is highly vulnerable. If you have one nuclear plant or a couple nuclear plants that can essentially, go down and cut off electricity to an entire country. So, I don't really see a huge, those would be my arguments for why I don't necessarily see nuclear being the pathway that is the obvious one.
Sarah or Nathan, do either of you want to tackle that one? There are now 3 different questions all about nuclear, so it's obviously a question on the audience's mind.
Yeah, I think at least what I'm seeing is that there'll be some short term, if you're looking in the 5-year horizon, there'll be some short term switching to shuffling around of global gas markets and some oil to Europe. Germany is going to try to fast track the building of 2 major LNG plants. Will that mean more nuclear coming online? It's really hard to say. I would echo Brendan's analysis that it makes nuclear power plants are a very obvious target for invading armies, as we've seen in Ukraine, where the major one that was under siege, it supplies 20% of the entire country's power, and the sort of the importance of decentralized renewables with much shorter supply chains and increased resilience, I think highlights the need for renewables and efficiency in places like the Ukraine, where you can't turn your power system into a weapon, and that's very obvious given the impacts of Chernobyl, and that's had in Northern Europe as well.
Okay, Sarah, I have a question specifically directed at you. Considering different approaches to the transition, someone wants to know what you think of Seth Klein's metaphor of war mobilization as a way to promote innovation and challenge existing industry incumbents or energy systems. They're particularly thinking of this metaphor with respect to the energy transition in Alberta.
Yeah, so I mean, I think where I see that parallel and where the war mobilization efforts are very powerful is that behind that is this, agreement, very strong agreement, usually within society, of this common goal of, here is the enemy that we have to defeat. That's a very strong language to use when you take it back into the domestic sphere and saying, certainly in Alberta, transferring that and calling the oil industry the enemy. Some will agree with that, some won't. I think one would have a hard time getting the same level of support in the province of Alberta for a statement like that. So, I do think that the war mobilization analogy, when it comes to this idea of coalitions of support, is really, very important and very true. And I think the scale, the other piece that comes with a war mobilization is that sense of urgency and the scale and the level of effort and financial resources and resources of all types that are willing to be committed to it. So I think that is very relevant. I think the piece for me that makes it sort of hard to say, well, that's just the solution, let's mobilize like a war, is that sense of what is the target and what is the goal, and can you actually, in a province like Alberta, reach that level of agreement in that same way.
Okay, I'm going to throw in my own question. I've held back in deference to the audience, but I know Sarah's written about this, but Nathan also raised it, and I think Brendan in some of his previous work has done a ton of it, of thinking about it. When we talk about the shift to post-carbon, yes, renewables, wind and solar are a key part of it. but for the post-carbon system to actually, successfully displace carbon-based energy sources, we need to look centrally at the infrastructure, which is the electricity generating system and the electricity grid that transmits electricity from where it's generated to where it's used. Quebec clearly has an advantage in many ways because of decisions made going back as far as the 1960s and 1970s, but there are lots of hydro sources in other parts of the country. Ontario recently was talking about, looking at building new hydro energy sources. One of the challenges is that where we have surplus hydroelectricity, we tend to ship it south of the border. And this goes back to thinking of, Harold Innis in the 1950s, that we had moved our patterns of trade from an east-west basis in Canada to a north-south basis. And I think we see it in energy as clearly as anywhere. What role do you see for both expanding hydroelectricity sources of energy in other parts of the country and possibly building a true national electricity grid across the country? Brendan, you know a little bit about Quebec.
I worked on it, but I don't. But I'm the one starting all the time, so I feel I can. I think the place. Yeah, I've worked a little bit on it in Quebec. I don't think actually Quebec, from my reading, has plans to build new hydro plants. In the mid future. I mean, they're actually talking much more about, which is exciting. Exporting, but also using their existing hydro, more strategically. So the place that I think is most exciting to answer this question, which has broad lessons for the rest of Canada, is where I'm originally from, which is Atlantic Canada or Nova Scotia. So this is the place in the country right now where you have very fossil fuel, coal dependent electricity systems building transmission lines to large hydro plants. So one in Newfoundland, but there's a vision to have a loop that goes through Quebec as well, and hopefully using that hydroelectricity for decarbonization. I think the question that I find interesting is, will that hydro essentially just crowd out other low carbon solutions, or will it crowd in low carbon solutions? Because the key opportunity with that hydro is it could provide that backup for domestic renewables, generation. And I think it's interesting in Atlantic Canada, where there's been great success with more community-based renewables development as well as energy efficiency. Are they going to use that hydro as almost just a backup for that more domestic agenda and domestic vision? Or perhaps will the hydro just be imported into that jurisdiction with few local benefits and perhaps not the most efficient or strategic use of that hydro?
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, so I certainly, I guess my answer partially is I hope that we will see more interconnections and more of a national or at least subnational sort of provincial paired type grid. Where I sit in Alberta, there's a huge opportunity to develop out our wind and solar resources. And we see that happening already, right? And in order to sort of the first tranche of those can be developed without that interconnection. But at some point, in the future, when we get to higher levels of penetration of wind and solar, there will be a lot of benefit of, say, interconnection with BC and using that hydro as a firming resource. So I think there is, the sort of technology and modeling of grids behind it would argue strongly for it. Again, here, there's sort of winners and losers like always, right? And here there are actually a lot of winners because you can develop out that resource and raise the value of the hydro that is generated in BC to be not just a source of sort of pure energy, but actually have a higher value as a source of capacity. There's of course losers in terms of those that are otherwise capturing that market today in Alberta, the peaking plants and maybe potentially eventually batteries as well. So again, I think there's this question of how do you get that coalition of support, and the fact that states in the U.S., more conservative states in the U.S. that have really embraced wind and solar development as a source of jobs and revenue, that we see that happening, I think bodes well for that potential future in Alberta. So, you know, to me, it's the classic story of getting Alberta's resources to market. It's just the wind and solar resources that we're talking about now. But certainly wouldn't downplay the politics that sits behind that.
Okay, and Nathan, we've
Yeah,
got a minute left.
I don't have too much to add on this question. All that to say is beyond the Atlantic Loop, which Brendan spoke about, there's already interties being built and funded by provincial companies, but also the federal government between Ontario and Quebec and between Manitoba and Saskatchewan to move those low carbon electrons to grids that have higher emissions intensity. And I think that is trending in the right direction. It's really encouraging. But we'll need to see more of that, I think, and to have the right incentives in place to encourage a diverse supply of electricity that can manage the shortcomings of renewables and leverage the best services that hydro can provide, knowing that there certainly are environmental impacts with hydroelectricity as well.
Okay, we're out of time. We've used our full allotment. I want to thank the three panelists for taking time out today to join us, and the audience for sitting in. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has as well. And thanks again to Brendan, Sarah, and Nathan for their contribution. Take care, everyone.